Good evening and welcome to Kaufman Corner, a Kansas City Royals podcast. With you, as always, the good doctor, Dr. Rany Jazayerli, one of the co-founders of Baseball Prospectus, and of course, author of Rany on the Royals, co-author of Robin Rany on the Royals. My name is Soren Petro from Sports Radio 810 WHB in Kansas City. You can hear my show from 2 to 6 Monday through Friday at 810WHB.com, and real news to talk about. Might get to a little bit about what to take away from the Astros, what to take away from the Phillies that the Royals can apply. But with the announcement of the 18th manager of the Kansas City Royals as Matt Quatraro, Quatraro, right? Is that Traro? Like the tra is the emphasis part. So I'm trying to make sure. Quatraro, right? How do you got it? I want to hear him say it about 5 times.
I was going to say, let's wait
Give
for
me
the
your shot,
press
man.
conference from his voice to our ears. Quatraro is what I'm saying. I think his name is designed this way so that we at least could say he's not completely perfect in every way. We still have to work on his name. But the first thing, obviously, thanks to the Royals for making this move today when they did. You and I were texting earlier today about possible topics for today's show, and I think we were either going to break down some grainy video from a 1973 Royals Brewers game, or debate which species of Kentucky bluegrass they needed to plant in the new stadium when they build it. So, unfortunately, we were able to put those aside. We have news, and that by itself is good. But it just so happens to be that the news itself is good. Because Matt Quatraro, even though we're still learning how to pronounce his name, is no stranger to this podcast, because from the moment the Royals, even before Mike Matheny was fired, and we started talking about who potential managerial candidates might be, we were talking about someone with experience in an organization such as the Tampa Bay Rays or the Cleveland Guardians. And once he was fired and the long list of potential manager candidates was put out there, he very quickly moved to number one on my list. And I've been doing this a long time, Soren, as have you. And every 2 or 3 years, it seems like the Royals fire their manager because they chose poorly the last time around. And immediately we put together a list of the managers that we think would make sense for this organization the next time around. And without fail, each time they do not wind up selecting somebody who's even on the list, which is why a couple of years later they fire that guy and they start the process all over again. And so the new Royals not only selected someone on the list, but they selected someone at the top of the list. I am not used to getting what I want from the Royals.
Is it scary, Rany?
It is terrifying. It is terrifying, Soren.
You don't get to be a sniper. This is your guy. If it doesn't work, you're on the hook.
Soren, do you recall the halcyon days of like June when we could start an entire episode, wind me up, you would say the words Cal Eldred, and I would just go for about 30 minutes, not even take a breath. The Rany rant may be a thing of the past. I am going to have to come up with something else to sustain me through these podcasts, because I'm not sure I can find things to criticize about the new Royals so far. I keep waiting for signs that the new Royals are not that different from the old Royals, but they keep proving me wrong in delightful ways. And this, to me, is certainly to this point, the most compelling piece of evidence that the Royals under J.J.Picollo are doing things differently than they were under Dayton Moore. Because Matt Quatraro is exactly the kind of guy they need, and very different from the guys that they've hired in the past.
Yeah. I think, it is, we joke around about like it's scary when you get the guy you wanted. But I want to double back to, your statement that we would talk about names and it would never be the names that we would discuss. This time it is. Do we know that that's good? right? Like, you know what I mean? Like, what we listen. I think we know quite a bit about the game of baseball, right? And in our own way, but we don't know the inner workings of individuals and the personalities that come with, being around them. Or not privy to get to interview the different candidates. So, and we don't act like we do, right? I always say that, I'm not a pitching coach, I'm not a hitting coach, I'm not a scout. So when I tell you about a prospect or something, I'm telling you about the numbers I've seen and comparing them to other players' numbers I've seen in 30 years of covering baseball. Um, and that this is similar, right? Here's the resumes. I'm making a decision, and I'm with you. I'm on the hook too, because this guy was tops on my list as well. Would have been a great story to see Dusty Wathan come home to Kansas City. Would have been a great story to see Pedro Grifol get a shot at managing. I think he certainly deserves it. But we've covered all the reasons why we didn't think those were the top guys. This was the top guy for this situation. What's going on with the Kansas City Royals right now? And so now he's here. Now we got to see. I'm like, let's. We always talk about, look, winning the press conference doesn't mean that you're going to win at the job, right? I don't think it hurts. I don't think it hurts at all, right? I think it shows a feeling for the room, a feeling for the audience, which I don't think, listen, he's got to reach his clubhouse, but I think understanding the moment and how to quantify the moment is something that you need to do, whether it's as a press conference talking to a group. I believe I'll be there on Thursday. The Chiefs coordinators are after that. So I think I'll be hitting Kaufman and then over to the practice facility. So we'll see what else comes up. But right now I'm planning on being there. Knowing the room is knowing the room, in my opinion. And I don't think people generally bomb the press conference and then are outstanding in front of their team. So I think we're going to see that. I think it's going to be interesting, the dynamics that are in place on this one. And I would ask you, what do you want to hear from him Thursday, 10:30 a.m. when he's announced? What's going to make you feel good after that? Again, not knowing that he's not going to make or break his time here, but just what would you like to hear from the guy when we kick this thing off?
Man, Soren, we got the guy we wanted, and you have to be a wet blanket all.
I'm not a wet blanket. I'm just saying, not at all.
No, look, you are absolutely correct in the sense that there's no guarantee this guy is good. It's not like he has, a track record and he's won 3 World Series with another team. This is an unknown quantity, right? To me, it's the process of getting to this guy that almost is more meaningful than the identity of the guy himself. In the sense that you say, do we know we're right? No, we don't know we're right, but can I say that the Royals process up until now was not good? Well, I present to you the win-loss record of the Kansas City Royals for the last 30 years. The previous way generally did not work, right? I think Ned Yost was a good manager, and I think he was an excellent fit for the roster and the front office, and he peaked at the perfect time, right? He came together as a tactical manager literally 2 weeks before the Royals went to their first postseason in 29 years, escaped what was probably the biggest tactical mistake of his career, which was bringing in Giordano Ventura mid-inning in the wild card game, which probably would have cost his job, quite frankly, if they had lost the game. And then went on the run of his life. But was he a great manager? Coming across the screen, yes. Eric Bieniemy's been screwed yet again.
I would have put that up there. I didn't mean to interrupt. Waited. But if anyone's listening to the podcast later on, we stream live Sunday nights, 10 o'clock. And Mike had a great one. Once again, Eric Bieniemy getting passed over.
Yep,
you can be a part of the conversation.
It's just not fair.
Yeah, on YouTube, Twitch, and Facebook. So if you want to be a part of the conversation moving forward, that's how you can do it. But anyway, go ahead. I was
going to say, so I don't know for sure, right? He could end up being anything. He has no track record as a major league manager. His resume is excellent, but yes, there's a wide variety of outcomes that could happen here. What I like about it is that one of those outcomes is that he is a great manager. And when you look at the guys that the Royals have hired over the years, there really isn't that one guy that I would say coming in, you just felt good about. This guy has a chance to be a terrific manager, a true difference maker on the upside as a manager. Like a guy like a Terry Francona in this division, right now who consistently seems to do better than you would expect with the teams that he's handed. Um, I'm gonna bring up a scary name here, but I feel compelled to do it because if I'm going to acknowledge that I like this guy, I have to acknowledge that the guy I probably felt had the most upside of any manager the Royals have hired in the last 25 years was probably Trey Hillman. And yes, you're laughing now. And the reason I say it wasn't that again, it wasn't that he had the perfect resume. With him, what was appealing to him is he was an unconventional hire, right? Came out of Japan, just won the Japanese World Series, and you're thinking the Royals are thinking outside the box. Well, that was maybe a box they should have stayed inside. And we could talk about how managing in Japan is actually a very different job. It's actually a lot easier because the culture there is such that the manager says jump and you say how high.
Right.
And we saw that very quickly in Kansas City when he reamed out the team in his first spring training on the field.
That was the day I announced this is not working.
And in retrospect, I mean, we know now, I think with Mark Grudzielanek, who was a veteran on that team, kind of pulled him aside afterwards and had to basically explain to Trey Hillman, that's not how things are run here in the Maybe you can do that in Japan. You can't do that here. But it was a hiring where they shot for them. They went for the high ceiling, but they got the low floor. It was a very high risk, high reward hiring. To me, Quatraro has the high reward side here, but the floor is pretty high too, because you look at that resume and he's managed in the minor leagues, which is important. He's not just been a coach, because a manager is an executive, right? He's a guy who actually has to. The buck stops with him, even if it's at A ball. You have to have having experience in being the guy that makes the decisions on a day-to-day basis is helpful. He has been a coach at the minor league level. He has been a bench coach, a third base coach, an assistant hitting coach. He's worked in two different organizations. He spent almost his entire time with Tampa Bay, but he spent 4 years in Cleveland. He's not a young guy. He's not a 35-year-old whippersnapper. He's turns 49 in a couple weeks. His playing career ended 20 years ago. He's been a coach for 20 years, 11 in the minor leagues, 9 in the major leagues. So you look at, he's done a little bit of everything. He's been, maybe he hasn't been with a ton of organizations, but the Rays, he was there when they were the Devil Rays and they sucked. And he was there when they made one of the most dramatic transitions I've seen a franchise make, going from like clueless expansion franchise after an ownership change, which I think is very interesting, to the lean, mean, efficient machine that the Rays from 2008 until today. And he was there through that transition. He went to Cleveland for 4 years. He came back. So everything there is, really top notch. The comments you hear from players and who've been under him as a manager of people are extremely positive. This is a guy who understands the analytics, but also gets high marks for his personal relationship skills. So what I'm looking for in that press conference is some sign of that charisma. We've never seen him speak. I don't know what he's like in front of the camera. You want to see that charisma. You want to see the kind of oral skills that will inspire guys in the clubhouse. And I think the big thing from what he says is simply that he is looking to bring a more data-driven approach to this franchise, especially on the pitching side, without losing the things that the Royals do well when it comes to treating their players well and maintaining their respect.
Let's go over a couple of the comments, because I think there's some good ones in here. And again, if you're with us on the chat room, hit that like button, the love button, the subscribe button. Any button that's a positive does us wonders. We would appreciate it. Don't cost you nothing, and it helps us out, so we'd appreciate if you'd hit that. Tony says, it's a win because this man has no previous experience at all with the Braves. I agree. This is not J.J.Picollo has had to come out of a comfort zone, right? And did it right out of the gates. He has not just gone to the well. He could have gone to Pedro Grafal, guys he's been around and knows. Instead, he went through a true interview process, talked with, the candidates and made a conclusion. And, I think that is a sign that, hey, he's been giving marching orders that he presumably was part of laying out in his conversations with John Sherman over the past couple of years, I'm sure. And then when John Sherman came to him and said, this is what I'm thinking about doing, their vision was the same. There was no way that you could arrive at what they said they wanted with anybody in-house. impossible.
Right. The one thing I will say, he does have that Guardians connection where John Sherman, could you say, well, to do that. But for one thing, he was assistant hitting coach. I'm not sure how much, exposure John Sherman has on a day-to-day basis to the assistant hitting coach. And I'm okay with having some connection if that connection is to a winning franchise who has proven that they can win despite not having a huge payroll. So, but the fact that most of his bones have been made with the Royals have really no connection to the Rays, and the Rays are the model for.
And let's go even further. Dayton Moore has somewhat resisted the Rays' ways.
Somewhat.
Well, I mean, I know he's done different things, but even just in conversations, right? You can tell he didn't want to hear much about the Rays, right? Like that and how they do things. And I think the fact that this organization is now embracing it, instead of saying, well, no, like I had a conversation just this year and I was told, ask people in Tampa if they think the constant turnover is helping them with their attendance. Right, which is something that I bristled at for a long time. The whole idea, Dayton Moore said it, and he meant it, and he backed it up. But I think it was at the detriment of the organization. He said, "Well, if you buy a jersey, you're going to be able to wear it. We're not going to just be turning guys over all the time." Okay, I mean, I get that. I've heard that about both the A's and Rays. That part of their attendance problems are that there's no connection between the players and fans. I don't buy that. I think
I don't buy that. That's really interesting, and that to me is completely misguided. They are the two worst ballpark situations in the sport. The Rays, the ballpark is indoor. It's weird. It's got all these bizarre angles and bizarre rules, and it's like 45 minutes away from most of the people who want to attend the game. You couldn't possibly put a stadium in a worse location in the Tampa St. Petersburg area.
Yes.
That has a hell of a lot more to do with it than the fact that you can't hold on to your Evan Longoria jersey for more than 10 years or whatever.
But this is a sign that J.J.Picollo is not operating that way. He is embracing what we have talked about for a long time. Instead of, saying there's another way, he's saying they've got a good way. And I'm going to bring somebody in. I remember when the Kansas City Chiefs had Scott Pioli and he was looking for a head coach. And the rumor was that Mike Shanahan was a guy. And I was like, that's perfect. That is two guys that have been successful, doing it very different ways, coming together, and hopefully you get the best of both. And that's what I see with Quatraro, right? Is that you get a guy, hopefully you can get the absolute very best of the Dayton Moore way, which has a lot of positives and has had successes, and the absolute best of the Rays and Guardians ways, and pull the best of all of it to create the new Royal way and have that succeed. So I do think that is very important that they've done that. And Vinny asked a good question as well.
Well, first, I just want to quickly say, I thought I was being mean by bringing up Trey Hillman's name. You brought up Scott Pioli and Mike Shanahan. You've triggered me twice for two very different reasons. How dare you, sir? But yes, this is why Quatraro was my number one candidate, precisely because the organization he came from was sort of the most diametrically opposed to the Royals way, with a proven track record of success. And that's why, to me, the key is bringing what the Rays do better than the Royals, which is a lot of things, but not necessarily throwing out the few things that the Royals do better than the Rays. But combining those two approaches.
And I said this, or I think I'm going to say it in about 10 minutes on Channel 41. When asked a question about this, Scott Pioli was a good hire in Kansas City. Quinn Snyder was a good hire for the Missouri Tigers basketball coach. Their resumes were great. It just didn't work. And this still has that possibility as well.
No question. The Pioli, that's why the process is as important, if not more important, than the guy, because the Scott Pioli process was great. It didn't work, but the process stuck around. The next time around, the Chiefs made the most impactful coaching hire of my lifetime as a Kansas City sports fan. So the process here is what I like.
Yeah, I hope that they understand. He brings with, like, Pioli's problem was he didn't understand how valuable Tom Brady was. He didn't understand how valuable Bill Belichick was, and that was his fundamental. He did the personnel thing. He got the cap in good shape. There are a lot of things he did right, but the two most important, quarterback and coach, he never did get right. And, I don't know that baseball has that same kind of translation to two major positions that you have to get. It's more of a spread across the board type of thing. So I think for that reason, Quatraro has a better chance to succeed. But I like this from Vinny because I've heard this from a number of people. Any concerns that this guy's expertise is hitting and not pitching? Can I point out that while the Kansas City Royals did finish 26th in runs allowed, they finished 24th in runs scored, and that the concept that the hitting is fixed is erroneous, and that they still have as much to do on the hitting side, in my opinion, as they do on the pitching side. Both sides of the have a lot of young players that did not come close to producing at the level it takes to play postseason baseball. So, yes, I get it. The overall fundamental problem in everyone's mind is the pitching. The hitting was not much better. Let's be crystal clear about it, right? It was not much better. And what the hope is that, yes, hitting is what he taught as a coach, but the reason he's being hired is he has been a bench coach. He has been a manager in waiting. He's been the manager's conscience on his shoulder for an organization that values analytics, values pitching, will think out of the box with the opener and whatnot, and that is what you're getting with him.
Yeah, I mean, his job as the manager of the Kansas City Royals is not to fix the pitching or fix the hitting. Right, it's what you have hitting and pitching coaches for. He's not going even if he was a complete savant at teaching hitting. The nature of his job is such that he's not going to be able to devote a huge amount of his time to doing that. That's why you have those coaches. One of the things that is appealing about hiring him, just from a standpoint of fixing things, is the connections he has, the people he knows within the Rays and perhaps Guardians organizations that do know how to fix pitching, and maybe to a lesser extent hitting, that they might start to look at hiring now. Like that's the next step. They still need a pitching coach, and hiring Matt Quatraro makes me feel a lot more confident the direction that they are going in terms of hiring a pitching coach, not just at the major league level, but throughout the organization. And the fact that he was in that organization for as long as he was, he probably knows people up and down that system. And I think that he's going to help bring in people, not necessarily all of them from the Rays organization. I think that'd be dangerous to do that and probably a little bit tacky. But he's not the one who's going to be working with the pitchers face to face all the time. He's going to have people doing that. But the key is for him to be on the same, have the same message as his pitching coach, and to establish the standards that if you aren't performing, that we have a place for you in Omaha, but we're not going to tolerate suboptimal performances. And that's why I feel very confident about this.
Yeah, no, I agree. Brian Bannister's name thrown around there a couple of times. I've heard that. I don't know if it's anything more than wishful thinking. The Royals have gone radio silent since the end of the season. I spoke with some folks last week, and they said really nobody's coming out till the manager gets hired.
Sure.
It's been hired. Will that hold until Thursday's press conference, or will they be willing to start talking now? Maybe. We'll see. I think it's interesting that it's Thursday. Makes me wonder a little bit, are they going to put together the whole staff before they announce him?
Well, here's what I think is going on. And actually, it's one of the things that I feel better about with the Royals. If you remember on Wednesday, the report came out that Dusty Wathan, who we had talked about as, a candidate, but not our number one candidate for the job, had signed a long-term, I believe a long-term contract with the Phillies to stay in Philadelphia. And my optimistic take on that, my concern was, there's a candidate that the Royals aren't hiring, and it wasn't my top candidate, that maybe they'll get somebody that's higher on the list, like Quatraro. But I was surprised that we would hear about Dusty Wathan basically taking himself out of the job before the Royals actually announced who they were hiring. My hope was, I mentioned this on Twitter, that he had basically been told that the Royals had already kind of made up their mind, that he had been told that he was not getting the job, but by keeping their situation sort of quiet, they gave him the courtesy of having the leverage to go back to the Phillies and say, give me some security and I'll stay. And that my hope was that we would hear this managerial announcement like the next day. And what I was reminded by our friend Joe Sheehan, we talked about how there was a rule. There used to be a rule that you couldn't make managerial announcements during the postseason. I was wrong. It only applies to the World Series. So when we heard about the for instance, the Marlins, and who's the other team that hired a manager during this process? The Rangers, and they had broken that code, but that code actually doesn't apply till the World Series. Well, sure enough, Friday and Saturday the Royals didn't make any noise, but today is an off day. And you mentioned the press conference is Thursday. The reason it's Thursday is because there are World Series games Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Like they are actually following the code here. But it actually turns out that is probably exactly what happened, that the Royals did Dusty Wathan the courtesy of going back to his old job, maybe with a pay raise and some security, but they had probably already made this decision a few days ago. And the reason I think that that's also important to know is that on Tuesday, the Marlins announced they were hiring Skip Schumacher as their manager, which was a bit of a surprise because Quatraro was one of their top candidates too. And at the time, I was like, gee, that seems like that's the sort of managerial hire the Royals would have done in the old days, where they hire a guy who's with a winning organization. He's an ex-player in the major leagues who was, a utility guy, kind of played everywhere, but not necessarily a top candidate. Now I'm wondering if even by Tuesday, the reason they hired Skip Schumacher, is that the Royals had beaten them out for Quatraro's services. We talked about this last week. If you had a choice of either job and you wanted to win going forward, the Royals' job was probably a better job. So there's a couple of we'll never know that for sure, but there are a couple of hints here that the Royals not only played this very well, but they actually beat out another franchise for Quatraro's services. I mean, he has been a hot candidate for a while. He has interviewed with at least 6 other teams before the Royals hired him over the last couple of years. The Pirates, the Tigers, the A's, the Mets, and the Giants, I believe, in addition to the Marlins, have all interviewed him for a job. So this is not, he's not a name that's familiar to Royals fans, maybe, but he is not just some guy who popped up, a pop-up candidate from this year. This guy's very well respected in the game.
I'll add that, going back to the subject of, is there concern that he's on the hitting side of things? Yes, he worked as a hitting coach, but as a player, he was predominantly a catcher, right? He played first and third and right and left, in his attempt to diversify his skills and make his way to the big leagues. He topped out at Double-A. So, no, he doesn't have major league playing experience, but he does have minor league playing experience, and he did catch. So he would see, and I like the catcher as the manager. I think it's the best position to hire because
something like 40% of managers are catchers.
Yes. And so that's his background. And so I think that's a positive for this team. What's first? What's next? Obviously hiring a pitching coach. I'm filling out a staff, all of that. That's the obvious. But then what? Right? Like, and do we think, like you mentioned, the rules about during the World Series, there are kind of rules about don't mess with, the team you're leaving's. The idea, well, can he bring all these different coaches?
Right. There's a limit. Right.
No. I mean, if it's a step up, then teams can grant that. But baseball's a little different. If you're under contract, they don't have to let you go.
They don't generally. If it is a promotion, they will. But you said within reason. If certainly, I mean, the Rays obviously just let Quatraro go. I don't know if he had a contract for next year or not, but no team's going to deny a guy a chance to become a manager. And if the Royals want to hire 1 or 2 guys from that organization and get a promotion, if they want to hire their minor league pitching coordinator to be their pitching coach, that might happen as well. But yes, that's why I think it's unlikely they're going to raid and get 10 guys, all the pitching coaches from the minor leagues. That won't happen. I've heard people say, Kyle Snyder, the Rays' current pitching coach, would be a great fit. Yeah, he'd be a great fit in Kansas City because he played for the Royals, like Brian Bannister. The Royals have all these guys who played for them, and then they don't seem to value their talents, and they turn out to be great coaches. You're not getting Kyle Snyder. He's the pitching coach. He's not getting a promotion to be a pitching coach in Kansas City. But, there are, I think that's one of the reasons why I think Brian Bannister is an interesting name, because he would come from yet another organization. And the Giants do things a little bit differently than the Rays. And that 2021 season, even if it was a fluke, is one of the most spectacular flukes I've ever seen from a baseball team, winning 107 games for a team that people didn't think would be at 500. I would love to have a coach with the insight into how the Giants accomplished that, even if it wasn't a guy that we already know very well in Brian Bannister. So I think that's certainly the next step, is filling out the staff. And when we say staff, not just a pitching coach, but pitching coordinators up and down the farm system. And then beyond that, then it's like, okay, you're presenting a completely new face to baseball with, compared to where you were even 3 months ago. Now it's time to go out and see in free agency, can you attract a different level of free agent to this organization that might not have looked at the Royals as a serious contender for their services, because they didn't see them as a serious contender for the playoffs, and convince those free agents that this is a different organization and we intend to be competitive right away, and we intend to give you the resources in the form of the pitching or the coaching staff to make you better right away.
Yeah, no doubt. And by the way, I wanted to put this up here. Cam corrected me. Got to AAA, 35 games for the Durham Bulls. So I want to correct that. And I did look back at the release, and you are right, Cam. Nice job on that. Always want to be factually correct there. I said AA, AAA is where he got to. Yeah, listen, like how much do we believe that he is just going to wave a wand and fix what was broken with the pitchers that are already on the staff?
I mean, we have to be realistic here. They're not going to fix everybody, but there are, when I look at this pitching, I can probably name 10 guys that it's like, this guy should be much better than he is. Whether it's some of the pitchers from that 2018 draft class or some of the relievers who are just walking too many, almost all of them, it's like too many walks, too many walks, too many walks. That's a big part. If they can fix 4 of those 10, and maybe it takes a year to figure that out, and by you have to struggle with those other 6, but by the end of next year you've got half the guys fixed, and the other half you dump and you bring in some of the talent from the, maybe meanwhile you're fixing some of the guys in the minor leagues like Asa Lacy or Alec Marsh. If you can fix some of those guys have the talent to be major league contributors right away. So no, I don't expect a 2008 Rays like emergence where the Rays went from 96 losses to 96 wins basically in one offseason. I don't expect that kind of improvement, but
what is fair to expect? What is, I mean, like, from a win standpoint, what's the timeline? Because that's one of the things that, sorry to cut you off there, Rany.
No.
That's one of the things that I really am looking forward to on Thursday is, and I presume J.J.Picollo will be a part of this conversation as well. When he did his last press conference, and we talked about this, he said, "Hey, we're making these changes." The Mike Matheny, Callahan one. This is a team that we thought was ready to contend. We didn't. We've fallen below expectations. And then later on, he was kind of, he talked about, well, it takes time. When you've got issues, when you've got 90 plus losses, when you're, what do they have? 96, 97 losses. 97, all said and done. You don't usually turn that around. To your point, what you just said about the Rays. And Danny Klinkskill asked him point blank, well, which is it? Which is this a team that should have been contending and so therefore ought to be contending next year, or is it a team that has real problems? And J.J.Picollo really just talked around it and didn't really address it. And I think it's because the answer is one he doesn't want to hear. It's really more than 97 loss team, unless somebody can fix all the pieces that are there right now. So my answer to that question is they're not going to contend next year. The next year is about fixing what can be fixed and jettisoning what can't. And then jump-starting things down low. That's the reality for me. But I do think that there needs to be a finish line for this guy and for J.J.Picollo. And as we've mentioned, when you stay with J.J.Picollo, the leash would seem to be shorter. So what's your timeline? Where would you put it to where this ought to be a winning team? We can call that either 82 wins or we can call that a playoff team, however you want to define it. What's the timeline? That's reasonable.
Well, I think for 2023, my goal here is that this is a 500-ish team. And by 500-ish, I mean, if they finish at 500 or let's say 78 wins or better, or if let's say their run differential, maybe they don't win that many games, but their run differential is close to even. Like there need to be signs on some level that this team is at 500 or very close to it. Going 71 and 91 is not, that's a 6-win improvement. That would be a disappointment to me.
Do you agree with me that with every win, the higher you go, the harder it is to get.
Absolutely.
And when you're sitting at 65 wins, 65 to 75 is fluff. I mean,
More or less, which is one of the reasons why it's been so exasperating to be a Royals fan, where they continuously, they can't even make that 65 to 75 jump. Like this, this isn't a team that missed the playoffs for so many years because they were always 74 and 88. They were usually 66 and 96 or 62 and 100. They couldn't even get the fluff wins. But yes, normally, if you look at throughout history of teams that win 65 and 97 or thereabouts, won 40% of their games, on average, those teams the next year made up about half the gap between 65 and 97 and 500, meaning they ended up around 450, or which is about 73 wins on average. So even if
which probably means they didn't get any better. It's just
some of that is regression. Some of that is just
happens.
bad luck turning into better luck. Yes. Some of it is you're going to be more aggressive about getting rid of bad players. When you're 65 and 97, you have some 2 or 3 truly terrible players on your roster that you can replace with anybody and improve. The Royals have those guys. Sometimes they stubbornly refuse to replace them, and there are at least 2 guys still on this roster, and I don't need to name who they are. 2 hitters on this roster who are still on the roster, even though they clearly were terrible this year, and more pitchers than that even. So, yeah, 70. I'm not going to give them credit for winning 72, 73 games. If they get to close to 81, or if they are close to even on runs and they just happen to have bad luck, that's a possibility. That's fine. In terms of 2024, I expect them to be above 500, which by definition puts you in contention at least until the last week of the season.
What do you think he's going to say when I or somebody else ask him, can you build a lineup with 6 or 7 sub 300 on base guys and expect to win?
Now, who are you asking, Picollo or Quatraro?
No, I will ask Quatraro.
Okay, because I think Quatraro will probably, I would like to think he will agree with you. I'd like to think he will understand that, on base percentage is important, and that sub 300 OBPs, you cannot sustain an offense that way. The one thing I will say on the other side of that is just baseball in 2022. What was the league average OBP this year? I mean, the offense has just come down so far that a 300 OBP is not the death knell it used to be. I mean, the league as a whole had a 312 OBP. The major leagues. That's 20 points lower than it was 10 years ago. So we all have to sort of change our frame of measurement that, a 300 OBP now is like a 320 OBP, 10 years ago. But the problem is, I mean, the Royals had, a 281 OBP from Nicky Lopez and a 264 OBP from Kyle Isbell, 292 from Hunter Dozier. It's one thing to be.
You're just getting started with the hits. Keep going.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, there's a lot there. But Bobby Witt at 294. That's disappointing for Bobby Witt because I expect greatness from Bobby Witt. 290. If the Royals have 1 or 2 guys in their lineup next year with an OBP in the 290s, I mean, Salvador Perez lives in the 290s. That's not the end of the world, assuming offense doesn't perk up next year. But I will say this: 2023, with all these rule changes, I think I'm really hopeful that offense will be up next year, in which case, all the more reason that you need to see OBPs that start with a 3 up and down the lineup.
Yeah, I that's one of the things that they don't do in Tampa, right? Unless you play a premium defensive position. Maldonado is behind the dish for the Astros right now. A guy that I don't want to say the Royals moved on. They had Salvador Perez. You can live with Salvador Perez, particularly if we get robot umps calling the strikes and his lack of pitch framing goes away. Then you can live with his, particularly with the power that he brings to it. You live a lot healthier with him back there. But you really need to play a premium defensive position, and you need to play it well, frankly, if you're not going to bring that, right? And so, but you can't have shortstops and second basemen and center fielders and corner outfielders. They can't be dragging their bat back and forth to the dugout 75% of the time. Can't happen. Right. And that's and I want to see if he will verbalize that. That is a known. And that's the thing is I know everybody will immediately, we got the guy we wanted. I'm for him. And I saw something, and I put it up there. It's like, oh, we got the hottest girl to say yes on the date. Now we're complaining about, whatever it is. No, now I'm beginning to analyze the hire, right? Like you wanted to know who I thought they should hire. Okay, they hired him. Now let's analyze it. Now let's talk about it. There are things he needs to say, right? And I will tell you that I'll be hugely disappointed if he gives some song and dance and tiptoes around the idea that yes, they have to get on base more, right?
I would be disappointed too, in part because I don't think he will say that. And let's look at the data. In the 5 years that he's been back in Tampa Bay, right? Because he was the hitting assistant head coach in Cleveland, I think, through 2017. So he came back in 2018, was a third base coach for a year, and then bench coach for 4 years. So throughout that time, the Rays have been a far more pitching oriented franchise than hitting, right? They have, I think, this year they were third in the league in runs allowed. They were second the year before. They were third the year before that. I mean, these are great. These are great numbers. Second in 2019 and second in 2018. They have not been lower than third in the American League in runs allowed in the 5 years that he's been there. On the offensive side, not quite as good. They're more of a league average offense. In 2021, when they won 100 games, they were second. But in those 5 years, even if the offense hasn't been great, here's where they rank in walks drawn as an offense. They were fifth this year. They were third last year. They were second in 2020, eighth in 2019, seventh in 2018. Now, keep in mind, the Royals have not finished above, I think they were ninth this year, and that was the highest that they had ranked in like a generation. So in every single year, the Rays have had more walks than the Royals have had at any point in the Dayton Moore era. And the last 3 years they've been top five. So even, and the point is, their walks have outpaced the offense as a whole. The Rays have been a more on base focused offense than their offense is in totality. So the deficiencies in their offense have been mostly in the lack of power, and some of that is just their payroll is so low that it's a lot harder to pay for power hitters than it is to find guys who can draw walks and get on base without exceptional power.
I want to highlight this one. Cam says, I agree with you, Cobb. An on-base percentage is important. I don't think it's as important as it's made out to be. No, it is. It is. It absolutely is. Cam, I'm sorry. You nailed it earlier. You got me earlier. But no, on that one, it's absolutely it. And it is not less important because the league average is down. It's just as important. It just means that your number doesn't have to be quite as high for you to be good at it. But it is no less important. It is the most important statistic when it comes to scoring runs. Without a doubt, Rany, will you back me up on that?
Do you know who I am, Soren?
I know you will.
Baseball Prospectus, Bill James disciple, like OBP. One of our slogans: OBP is life, and life is OBP. Like,
yes,
it is very important, and it is, if you aren't convinced on-base percentage is important, you may have been a Royals fan for the last 30 years because you've never heard anybody ever tell you that. But yes, it is. The Royals are dead last in the majors in walks over the last 30 years. It's not even close. And you can see for yourself what that has brought them in terms of success on the field. So among the many things that I feel is changing with this organization, this was something even when Dayton Moore was still general manager, we were talking about how the walks this year seem to be more of a priority than they had been with Zumwalt and Saylor. And I'm hoping that we're going to see more of that. I want to bring up a specific player, actually.
Wait. Before you do, okay. Can we do this? Cam fires back. OPS is more important, in my opinion. On-base percentage is important, too. Appreciate that acknowledgement. OPS is not more important than on-base percentage.
Well,
I want to be clear.
OPS is on-base percentage plus slugging.
Right.
And yeah, I mean, so technically it correlates with run scoring more than OBP alone. But OPS, the O stands for OBP. So
but here's the thing. Slug is a product of being able to see what a strike is. Okay.
Right. Slugging can derive from plate discipline.
The greatest on-base guys are also the greatest sluggers. And it starts with getting a good pitch to hit. If you've ever read anything about Ted Williams, that's the first thing. There are a handful of guys, Kirby Puckett, Vladimir Guerrero, who could walk up to the plate and swing out of their shoes and swing at everything
Right.
and still
And
have an
and
effective on base.
that kind of hitter has been the platonic ideal for the Royals for
Yes.
generations, and those guys are like one in a million. Like there are a handful of guys in the major leagues at any given time who can consistently be successful with that kind of
Yeah.
approach. You will find guys who can do it for a year or two, but if you show me two young guys who both hit for power, and one of them swings at everything, the other one has plate discipline, I'll bet on the guy with the plate discipline to
Right.
continue it.
And I just want to get this in, then we'll get to your player because, and I'm not picking on Cam, and Cam knows. Cam and I go way back, and I get it, and I do like OPS, and it's a good stat, and slugging is important, but this is why I want to be so clear about the on base part of the equation is because that's what I want to hear from them, right? I want them to start saying the things that are a known fact and saying them comfortably so that not dancing and saying there are a lot of fact. We mentioned the Scott Pioli thing, and you'd ask him about quarterbacks, and he would spar with you and say, it's a process. It's a 53-man roster. No, quarterback. That's where it's at. And if you won't say it, you start to convince yourself of your own bullshit. Okay, that's what it comes down to. And I want the Royals to be done convincing themselves, right? And I want them. This is the easiest time to flat out say the right things about what really matters with the team. That's why I think it's because to a degree that, we want to be on board with this hire. We want to like it. Okay, and I do too. But it begins with them acknowledging what has to change. And if they won't acknowledge it, I don't want Quatraro indoctrinated into their old way of doing things. I want him to bring them into the right way of doing things. That's it. I'm off my soapbox. Very important to say. If you can't say it, I don't believe you can do it.
Absolutely agree. Like the whole point of hiring Quatraro is for the perspective that he brings. And if the Royals' existing perspective ends up trumping his new perspective, then what was the point?
Right.
And that's why they're bringing him in. And I want to bring up a specific player here by the name of Yandy Diaz. I don't know how familiar you are with Yandy Diaz, but Yandy Diaz came up, and the reason I think he's such an instructive person is he came up with the Guardians around the time that Quatraro was the assistant hitting coach in Cleveland. In 2017, he was an old rookie, as 25 years old, but was a guy who consistently had great on-base percentages in the minor leagues. 403, 408. He had a 454 OBP in AAA when they finally called him up. Had a 352 OBP as a rookie. And then had a 375 OBP in 39 games in 2018. That was the first year that Quatraro was back in Tampa Bay. That winter, the Rays traded for Yandy Diaz. And they traded, it was a 3-team trade. Carlos Santana was somehow involved in this deal. Like the Mariners were involved because J.J.Picollo loves to get involved with every trade that any teams make. He feels left out if he's not included. But from the Rays' perspective, they gave up a guy named Cole Sulser, who was a power guy. Yandy Diaz does not have a ton of power. But Cole Sulser was a guy who had power, but sorry, not Cole Sulser. It was Jake Bauers. My mistake. Jake Bauers is the guy. He had some pop. He was a first base left field type, and he had just had his rookie season. Only had a 316 OBP, but it hit 11 home runs. Yandy Diaz, at that point, his career high in home runs in the minors was 9. He had 4 home runs in his major league career. Well, in 4 years with the Rays, his first year, he had a 340 OBP. The last 3 years, his OBPs go 428, 353. This past year, 401 OBP, mainly as a third baseman. He's quietly one of the most valuable players on that team. And while he doesn't hit for a ton of pop, he hit 14 home runs one year, 13 home runs. He hit 9 this past year. You have a 400 on-base percentage, you're going to be valuable no matter what. But a 400 OBP with 33 doubles and 9 home runs, he had a 423 slug. That's a 143 OPS plus. Like, that's a very valuable player. Keep in mind that the field, the Tampa Bay, the Play Tropicana field, it's kind of a pitcher's park. So keep in mind that their offense is probably a little better than it looks. But Yandy Diaz, I wonder how much Quatraro had in convincing them to trade for him. And he certainly saw the success you can have with a guy who's an on-base first player. Jake Bauers, the guy they traded to get him, has basically washed out of the major leagues, never really panned out. It's a trade that the Rays absolutely won. They have an everyday third baseman who gets on base at a 40% clip. The Royals could use that. Very much so. A third baseman who gets on base. They could use any player who gets on base at a 400 clip. 400 OBP in today's game is a miracle. So I fully expect that is what they're getting with Quatraro. And I fully expect that if he is specifically asked about the importance of on base, that he will give us an answer that you and I agree with on Thursday. If he does not, then yes, that is a red flag.
Yeah, and he's got some work to do. And can we agree that this team has to become more transactional, and we should start seeing some low on base guys traded for high on base guys?
Transactional in general, yes. I mean, that's one of the things the Rays do well too, and it'll be interesting. That is not a manager level decision. Obviously, that's a GM level decision. So I don't expect that to change as dramatically as what's going on the field. But I certainly hope that this certainly does not hurt in the process of the Royals becoming a more transactional franchise. And I think Quatraro will have some impact on who it is that gets traded. And like you said, on base percentage will be, I would think, certainly a metric that they will evaluate their players much more harshly on. The complicating factor is that when you think about low on base guys, the two most famous low OBP guys on this roster are Salvador Perez and Adalberto Mondesi, both of whom are basically untradeable at this current moment for very different reasons. Perez is a franchise cornerstone, and Mondesi, the mere act of putting him on the market probably will drop his value 50% because everyone's like, well, why are the Royals giving up on him now? They're kind of stuck there. So I don't expect immediate overnight changes, but I do think that going forward, this will be a philosophical change for the franchise.
And I hope what will happen is that they allow him to evaluate the roster, and I'm sure in some ways he's probably already done this as part of the interview process, and be open if he says Bobby Witt Jr. is your center fielder, or Mondesi's your center fielder, and this is where we're going with this. Enough is enough, and let's go. And because he carries no baggage, right? Like there's no I've been defending this guy for 5 years and I've got to make it work here. He comes in fresh, open mind, and he needs to be listened to about those things. And maybe it's in spring training, right? That he walks in and looks and says, okay, this is where it's acceptable, right? We can have him out there. But I really hope that he is listened to. And I think he will be. I think that's why they went and got him.
Right.
Right? If they wanted to hear everything's okay, they would have hired Pedro Grifol.
Exactly.
And that's not what they did.
That's why the process is as important as the final outcome. Yeah, I mean, I don't want him. There's always a danger that you bring in a new guy and he's willing to give up on players too easily because he's not invested in them. But certainly having a fresh, open mind about where you position guys, because that is one of the sort of underrated problems with this franchise right now is that they don't know where to play a lot of their players. There's a lot of positional uncertainty right now between Witt and Mondesi, and because those are two guys that are literally in the center of the diamond, where they play affects where everybody else plays too. And the Royals probably need to make some bold decisions there. It may be a matter of moving a guy from the rotation into the bullpen. I mean, I don't think Chris Bubich would be better in the bullpen, but you got to be open to basically anything at this point. There's a lot of talent here. I'm convinced of that, but molding that talent into the shape of a winning baseball team is going to take some hard decisions. And I'm hoping that having a fresh viewpoint will make that easier for them.
Any final thoughts on this? Anything else you want to hear on Thursday when he's announced before we wrap up?
I mean, I think the big thing is simply a commitment from the organization, and not maybe specifically from him, that this is just the beginning of adding fresh voices to the organization. That, if Quatraro is allowed to bring in his own bench coach, then maybe they'll keep Pedro Grifol around as a way to maintain some continuity. But if they do that, they need to bring in more people from other organizations into, if not at the major league level, and certainly at the minor league level. So that may be a question that you ask Picollo more than Quatraro, but I'm hoping he will have some a voice in who those people are. But I just want to see. I want this to be the beginning of a process of transforming the organization and not the end. If this is it, and they don't make any other significant changes and bring everybody else in house, that's not going to be sufficient.
Yeah, I'll reiterate. I hope we hear him say the things that need to be said, acknowledge the facts that are certainly out there about how the game is played today, and not be afraid of it, because that will be the first sign of I'm sorry, the second sign of real change. He's the sign of real change. The second sign will be that it's full speed ahead with even more, which is the way I think. And again, let's be clear. There are a lot of things that are done right by this organization, right? And you want to hang on to those things, but there are also things that need to be brought into the modern age of baseball, and hopefully we hear that on Thursday. Rany, great stuff as always. Always appreciate the conversation. Look forward to our chat next Sunday, my friend. Remember, if you're catching us on the podcast, we stream live Sundays at 10 p.m. Central throughout most of the offseason. That's when we'll be. I'm sure there'll be some times where we're not quite going at that time, but we'll let you know when that's the case. Make sure you follow us on Twitter at Jazayerli, Jazayerli, and at Soren Petro, Sorenpetro. That's where you can find us on Twitter, and we'll keep you up to date with what's going on with the Kaufman Corner podcast. So for the good doctor, Dr. Rany Jazayerli, I'm Soren Petro saying thank you very much for joining us here on Kaufman Corner.